Hello, beautiful community. Let me know in the chat if you can hear me. And we're going to get straight to our first question, which is an interesting one. All today's questions, I think, are going to revolve around that strange title. Is there a sense in which Putin is still planning a big war against NATO? And what could that possibly mean in the context of him losing in Ukraine? Did Putin poison Alexei, this came a few times, Navalny, to prepare the ground for the Ukraine war? This is very interesting. And I think the answer here is yes. But there are a few nuances. So, with a lot of the political murders in Russia over the past decades, it's not necessarily the case that they were all vertically done. So we've got to be clear that just because an opponent of Putin dies in Russia in the last quarter century does not necessarily, it could, but does not necessarily mean that Putin ordered it. But with Navalny, there is a clearer verticality. And that doesn't mean that Putin sat in his office and said, do this to him, but it probably means that there was a conversation about escalating measures against Western political sabotage of Russia's political system, and that kind of escalation was permitted and encouraged. And so off you go now and do this. Now, the war in Ukraine and preparation for the war in Ukraine meant that Russia was going to take a partial totalitarian turn. And you've heard me talk about it for eternity, particularly on the main channel over the last few months. Now, that turn was partial, right? It only went about a quarter of the way. And since then, it's been escalating, but only little by little by little. This was already being prepared before the war, and clearing the scene by getting rid of Navalny, either by incapacitating him or simply eliminating him, was a preparatory step. What then happened is that the war began to go so badly that they needed to take more of a totalitarian turn than they expected to. They probably wanted to go, let's say, an eighth of the way there. They went a quarter of the way there. And as the war is going from bad to worse, they've had to consider escalating it further. And that's what we're going to see in 2023. So yes, I believe it's a reasonable thought to have that the poisoning of Alexei Navalny was part of this story of refashioning the Russian state and the Russian social order in preparation for this escalation against the West. And that means that Navalny's return to Russia was inevitably going to result in him being put away. And we're going to talk more another time, I think, about what happens with Navalny next. This is an unusual question, actually, could Ukrainian society get fatigued if the war goes on for a long time? Well, it already experiences this war as utter hell, but fatigued in the sense that the West could get fatigued? No, absolutely not. Quite simply because the war is backed by genocidal rhetoric from Moscow. So if people are coming to kill you and they're saying that you don't exist, you shouldn't exist, you aren't really real, you're not going to get fatigued about opposing that. It would be humanly impossible in that sense for there to develop fatigue. Is Greg Yudin, who is a wonderful Russian political philosopher, right that Putin is preparing for a big war with NATO? And what does this mean given Putin's military failures in Ukraine? Well, this is really important. There is a kind of a doctrine in the Kremlin that the West is in democratic decline, and the doctrine runs far ahead of reality, right? It assumes that we are declining much more than we really are. And there is a consequent thought about the weakness and dissolution of NATO. So it's a kind of a doctrine of democratic decline mediated dissolution of NATO. And even though it doesn't look like happening now, they think that there is a kind of inevitability to this and a kind of logic to it, that it must come eventually. So it's very important to take this into consideration when we're understanding the aspirations of the Kremlin. So the aspiration to take Kiev remains there. The aspiration to take control and kick NATO out of Eastern Europe remains there. As nutty as that might look to us, because there we see the Russian military struggling in southeastern Ukraine, but the aspiration very much remains that this happen, even if it can't happen tomorrow, even if it can't happen 6 months from now. And you are seeing a corresponding militarization of Russian society. And we're not just talking about militarization of the economy or militarization of, the social fabric in Russia. We're talking about specifically intervention in the education system to prepare younger generations. It's a good question whether it's going to work, but there's an intervention, a very significant intervention in the education system to prepare younger generations for war and to get them to think of themselves as really leading lives whose meaning might be derived from some kind of very large scale war against the West. So this is real. This is thought of in the medium term, right? And it's rather fueled by this idea that, if only you hold out for another couple of years, this presentation of Western strength. I'm loving all of your commentary, by the way. I'm very grateful. I'm just seeing it out of the corner of my eye. But this presentation of Western strength cannot be ultimately real. And the West's resolve will eventually dissolve. So there is really a sense in which Russian society is being prepared for some kind of a large confrontation with the West. And insofar as Greg Uden is saying that, I think he is conveying something that's important and something that's hard to grasp, because we're seeing Russia struggle so much in Ukraine that it seems absurd to talk about Russia taking on all of NATO and making plans accordingly. But that is, in fact, what, in my assessment, is going on. Can you talk about the significance of the surface-to-air missiles being installed on buildings in the Moscow area? That seems real. I don't know what the scale of it is, but we're seeing videos. I don't want to comment on the military significance of it because that's not my lane. But it is clear that there is a welcome byproduct here, which is that people should think of themselves as being increasingly involved in some kind of a long-distance conflict. So this is designed to contribute to a siege mentality. The fact that this is just done without any special propaganda packaging to it, that one can suspect that that's going to be a byproduct. Now, is that going to work? I think it is going to work for a lot of people. I think a lot of people who are oppositional to the regime, and certainly that's an enormous number of people in urban capitals, they're going to want to run away when they see that. But I think for a lot of people, it's going to contribute to a kind of siege mentality and could constructively play into the regime's hand when it comes to escalating little by little the militarization of society. What should be the aims of a wise Western leader in this war? Well, politics is complex, so they're going to be conflictual, right? So let's put aside obvious candidates here, like the furthering of one's career in certain ways, which is a legitimate goal. And let's put aside the furthering of one's political party or political organization and say a few things about the external gaze and the internal gaze. From the point of view of the internal gaze, it's very important that we are cautious about not undermining democracy at home by doing certain things abroad. And you know what position I encourage in this community to take on the war, which is that Ukraine should be supported even more than it's being supported now. But there's a hypothetical situation that isn't quite real anyway yet that's worth thinking about. And it's something like this. Imagine you have a country where 50% of the population don't just feel sort of uncomfortable about supporting Ukraine, but they actually feel that that is positively a betrayal of them. So a politician ought to consider that, because you've always got to deal with the real feelings of citizens, not with the feelings you would like them to have. Now, that's not a situation we're quite facing anywhere yet, but it's a hypothetical worth thinking about, particularly as Western fatigue increases over time. Because it's a win for Putin if Western societies lose their democracies. That's an ultimate win for Putin, right? And so we've got to be very careful about this. I'm not saying that there is a connection at the moment, but it's a hypothetical worth looking at, where we say, well, look, if foreign policy actions we are taking are causing toxic and existential, right, democratic fragility at home, and we've got to be worried and take important steps. But putting this hypothetical domestic gaze aside to look externally, there are two overwhelmingly clear aims. One is you're responsible to your citizens, the citizens of your country, whether you're French, German, Danish, Canadian, to avoid nuclear war. And you're responsible for helping bring about a Ukrainian victory. So I think there are these two aspirations, a Ukrainian victory and avoid nuclear war. And then there are some secondary aspirations from the vantage point of this external gaze still, such as getting rid of the Putin regime and minimizing the risk of something internally catastrophic happening in Russia that impacts the whole world. For example, Russia breaking up and engulfing in an internal nuclear war. But the key issue with all of these considerations, and this is just a cartoon, of course, that I'm giving you, is that you've got to be clear about how much these considerations conflict with one another and how much they don't. So you shouldn't overestimate how much they conflict, but you shouldn't underestimate how much they conflict. So let's give just one very brief example that I think you're all familiar with. And that is the argument which I find unpersuasive. And that is that compromising with Putin significantly reduces the risk of nuclear war. Now, I don't recognize that argument. I don't think it's correct. So it's an example of overthinking the extent to which two aspirations conflict, avoiding nuclear war and helping Ukraine. But it's also important, of course, to not underestimate conflict between these different hypothetical aspirations. Is there a one-line critique of Germany's reluctance to support Ukraine to victory? It's really important to not be glib about the foreign policies of major states. There's been plenty of humor at the expense of the French foreign policy, the German foreign policy. You've got to understand that these are enormously complex political processes with a history. that to a great extent conditions what's possible. But if you wanted something sort of cartoonish, then I would say this, that there's a risk of security in the argument that says we're going to support Ukraine as long as the war lasts within certain limits, because how long the war lasts is precisely a product of how much you support Ukraine and what limits on that support you set. What is the most important thing we should know about Russian society that you don't talk about in your videos? Fear. How far what people are doing now, in particular that depoliticized blob in the middle that we often talk about, that 50 to 60% of the Russian population that are radically detached from politics, how far fear structures their behavior and their thought. It's very, very important to not underestimate that. Now, this is not happening here on this on the main channel, in the live tab of the main channel, because we're migrating the chat channel here. We're not. We're just making a more fluid connection between the conversations we have on the chat channel and the conversations we have on the main channel. This is going to continue. And I'm particularly grateful for the fantastic participation and thoughtfulness of all of you in the comment section. And what I'm keen to do a few times soonishly, maybe that'll happen on the chat channel, is do a few Q&As where we're not focused on producing content that people can watch an hour or two later, but we're just interacting as a community through the chat section. So expect that to come. And I want to say thank you very, very much for being with me today. And I look forward to being with you very, very soon on either of the two channels. Lots of love. Bye. 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 Bye.